Let's discuss some interesting trends or news in the Bitcoin space to cut through the flashy headlines and see what's happening in the market. I think the overall trend and kind of all the other trends we feed into is the number graph thingy. Also there's a really bullish case for Bitcoin. And reason being is that the trend currently are all pro Bitcoin. So maybe we can discuss a little bit about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm more than happy to do so. Wow, there have been quite some news, right, in the last couple of weeks. And while Bitcoin is oscillating between, I think, 100K and 110K, there have been quite some astonishing news also on the geopolitical level. And I think it makes sense for us to deep dive.
Yeah, cool. So maybe we start with the elephant in the room. So the institutional investments keep flowing in. So there's positive trends. And if you look at the numbers since the launch of the ETFs last year, there have been huge amount invested and are rising again as of June 2025, which is a really pro Bitcoin stance, I would say, from the institutional side. What do you think?
Yeah, 100%. So we have a billion of inflows in these ETFs alone, and certainly major institutional adoption. So the industry was like literally the last 5-6 years discussing when we see institutional adoption finally, and they actually came. So it came not by natively adopting Bitcoin, which would be probably the preferred way, but for major corporates and other pension funds and other institutions, it certainly makes sense to adopt the Bitcoin ETF. Certainly there are downsides, but this is not our subject now.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually see something in Bitcoin, and this has changed, right? Either they use it as an inflation hedge or they want to use it for diversification, whatever they're using it. Certainly institutional adoption has driven a Bitcoin dominance to over 64%, according to CoinMarketCap at least. And if you calculate the stablecoin volume and deduct that from that, this is not done by CoinMarketCap, but other providers do that, you actually reach a Bitcoin dominance of 77% if you deduct stablecoin volumes. When you compare Bitcoin with all other crypto assets, excluding stablecoin, the majority of value, 77%, is right now allocated in Bitcoin. And this is certainly thanks to the aforementioned institutional adoption.
Yeah, which is the ETFs and the Treasury companies is a huge topic as well. And then from time to time, you also hear discussions about the halving, which in combination with this institutional investments is spoken about in terms of a supply shock that might come in like around 18 months after the halving, which would be October.
So the supply shock or potential supply shock, which more or less everyone is talking about a lot recently, for most proclaimers, it's expected by somewhere in autumn or end of the year. And the rationale is if the ETFs are buying in that pace, then the total supply that is hovering the exchanges right now is depleted by probably autumn or end of the year. I get that. It certainly will change some dynamics, but on the other hand side, when the price will be driven a bit, then certainly all the reserves and all the issued Bitcoin will be liquidated by major players in the market who accumulated early. Yeah, so I discussed this topic with a lot of Bitcoiners, and there's these two segments. On the one hand side, people say, okay, we have the supply shock because there will be only 21 million ever, and we have reached 95%, and 99% are reached in 2031, I think. And this has to lead to a supply shock. And to a certain extent, this is true in general. It's a hard asset, 100% hard capped and limited. On the other hand side, certainly there are some early investors who actually took the risk. Right now, Bitcoin is not risky anymore. If we reach 100,000, and it's very likely that it will reach 1 million or even more. So back then, when we had 10 USD Bitcoin, it was much more uncertain and much more unlikely that it will reach 100,000 USD. But now we have reached 100,000, and it's obviously more likely that it will reach the 1 million level. And we can argue at which point of time and what are the market dynamics behind it. But the core essence here is early investors who took the risk. They certainly cash out a bit. Obviously, the Bitcoiners have the mean you never sell your Bitcoin. Okay. But you know what? I also discuss it a lot with Bitcoiners. I get that you can bring your funds to your kids and have that inherited certainly makes sense. You build generational wealth, 100% agree on that. You have intergenerational security, also check on that. But on the other hand side, there's people who invested so early. They bought like a Bitcoin on $10, and there's certainly room for getting a bit liquidated to still be super large holdings. So I expect they will fund the exchanges. And so I don't expect a crazy supply shock in the end of the year overall, right?
Okay, yeah. And this is what you actually see in the numbers already, that you got some retail outflows and institutional inflows, right? That's underlined by the numbers, or you're saying that this trend is already there. Cool. Yeah, what next? Geopolitical.
Exactly, geopolitical risk. So what we've seen a while ago was like Israel and Iran got into heavy fights, heavy rocket exchange. And while on this weekend, this happened, I think, on a Saturday and Sunday. And on this weekend, capital markets completely were closed, obviously. But the only thing that you actually can trade was Bitcoin. And the BTC price lost like 1 or 2%, but it was surprisingly stable. And stable in terms of it has been like a risk-connected asset. It was very volatile, especially in events of geopolitical impact. Okay, you can argue that was not of huge impact. Okay, fair point. But you couldn't have known, right? It could be easily the complete starting point of a complete escalation. So you can argue, and there's certain Bitcoiners arguing that we see a shift from a risk-on asset to a risk-off asset. Which you have the opportunity to have 24/7 trading capabilities. And it's basically a safe haven. Volatility, it's automatically reducing by larger volumes, obviously. And you can argue that it's a risk-off asset because at any point of time, no matter what happens, 24/7, you can liquidate at a fair price, actually, which is not even possible with highly liquid stocks and bonds, right? Because they're closed on the weekends, the capital markets or the exchanges. And yeah, this is certainly a perspective on it. How's your perspective on Bitcoin as a new risk-off asset?
Yeah, I think if you looked at the numbers, it is like in the beginning of 2025, I think in February, the correlation with the S&P actually went to zero, which is it's a risk-off asset. So it's not correlated with the stock market anymore in this phase of the year. And I absolutely agree that you can liquidate. So again, you need to take stuff in your own hands. So you can't stay with the ETFs, but you actually have to do it yourself. And I think there's actually a trend that is a risk-off asset, while you see investors who maybe didn't grasp the whole potential of Bitcoin yet. So you still have some correlation there. So if something unexpected happens, still there's fear in the market, and it gets multiplicated because long positions are liquidated. So it's a lot harder. And then you have like the liquidity shortage on weekends. It drops a lot more because the price goes up and down a lot more because of the reduced liquidity. So yeah, I'm actually with you. I think the trend to risk-off asset is there, but we are not there yet. So.
Yeah, fair point. It's interesting to see that it's double-edged sword, right? So you have the only liquidity on the weekend. So the only thing that people could liquidate is Bitcoin over the weekend. You can liquidate it, but it's the only thing that you can liquidate. So you have to de-risk, obviously, to do that. Yeah, interesting to see. And obviously, everyone is talking about this Bitcoin Treasury thing right now. This is dominating the discussion. Every company is talking about their Bitcoin Treasury, and that you have not the P&L gains, but the balance sheet gains. And yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the bet those companies are doing is obviously, from where I'm standing, one that makes a lot of sense. Because if you think about Bitcoin as an appreciating asset, and that comes in with the increased money supply we are currently seeing. So with that, I think the logic behind Bitcoin as a treasury asset, it a lot of sense. So yeah, I think it's an interesting trend. And while maybe the risk appetite not from all investors are there yet, so maybe it's firing back a little bit, but I think in general the trend makes sense, and it speaks for Bitcoin as a store of value, especially in times where everybody is really scared about debasement of their currencies. Yeah, what do you?
Yeah, I agree. So, and when you look through the list of top holders, obviously we have large concentration on the top. So with strategy MSTR as their ticker symbol of about 600,000 Bitcoin. And then obviously there's a couple of miners like Marathon and Riot, and the usual suspects like the Japanese MetaPlanet, for instance, pivoted quite early into, and we have a couple of German companies as well. So I think the largest one, this has been around basically forever, is the Bitcoin Group SE, listed in Germany. And they have been around forever because they had an early stage Bitcoin exchange platform, and they have quite some decent Bitcoin stack. And there's, I think the stack brings into the top 8 position worldwide as a holding company, but they've zero marketing on this topic, right? So no one actually knows that Bitcoin Group is kind of an asset that you could have. You've also have the advanced Bitcoin technologies and some other smaller ones like Everts Pharma, friendly news, also German company. Yeah, so there's a couple of approaches or attempts from the German market as well. But I think marketing-wise, of course, the US companies are much stronger positioned right now. But in general, it makes sense, right? Either if you buy that as an hedge against inflation, hedge against counterparty risk that you have in fiat currencies, whatever you use Bitcoin for, if you actually plan to use that as a medium of exchange. I know there's rumors that Bitcoin can't be used as medium of exchange. I know from firsthand it can be. I actually bought this book via Lightning. We can talk about that in a second. Yeah, so treasury companies, I think it will be completely normal to have your standard portfolio in fiat and a couple of bank accounts. If you have a larger treasury operations, it's completely normal to distribute your risk to several banks and also get into coin as an hedge against inflation. And yeah, let's speak a bit about this nice book here. So it's called Das ehrliche Geld, The Honest Money in English, from Alex von Frankenberg. I met him and we had a good chat. Greetings, Alex, if you hear this by chance. And yeah, I bought his new book. I managed to read a couple of chapters in the very beginning, and it is really quite nice. Explains Bitcoin from the very basics and is underlying the authenticity of money and the importance of money, right? So starting at the very basics, this is a book that everyone can, in my opinion, should read to get on the same level, because we have to rediscuss the issue of money, right? So there's a saying, right? You spend like 400,000 of hours in your life to earn money, then you should invest a small fraction of maybe 40 hours to understand money, right? And I think that this book is a good starting point if you're starting from zero. Yeah.
Nice. So you're diving into and trying to understand what's going on. And once you start, you get hooked anyways. So yeah, it's just, yeah. Other trends. I think there's one thing which Donald Trump said, which was noteworthy. I just read this out. It has become amazing. And he means Bitcoin with that. I mean, it is the job that it produced. And I notice more and more you pay in Bitcoin. People are saying it takes a lot of pressure off the dollar and it's a great thing for our country. And I think there's 2 really interesting things in this statement if you dive into it. And this is, first, he says, you pay in Bitcoin. That is something which is kind of new because, as you just said, a lot of people are not there yet from their journey. They think it's a stock value, and that coming back to the treasury companies and so on, that's how they use it, and that's the image and the reputation. It's just building. That's in the news. People need to start understanding that. But the payment thing is not that much in the news because it's not driven by the huge institutions and the public media and so on. He said this, so that's interesting. And it takes a lot of pressure off the dollar. And that's the other thing, which is very, very important. There's also something which is discussed in the Bitcoin scene a lot, but not in the public yet, is how the dollar as reserve currency is particularly positioned in a role to actually have kind of a trade deficit and therefore overvalued currency, which has certain effects on its own country and on other countries. And actually, what he's saying is that something like Bitcoin, a global currency that cannot be inflated, can actually take the pressure off. So I think this is something you should watch what's going on there that is starting to actually being discussed in public from the US president. What do you think?
Thanks for elaborating. This is crazy. Think about it. He said Bitcoin will help lift the burden of the US dollar. Wow. If you would have asked me, like, having any US president mentioning Bitcoin to this extent, if you would ask that to me for like a couple of years ago, I would explain to you crazy, right? And now we actually have that. This is crazy what you said, right? Giving people an alternative that the government does not control. This is something that he said recently, right? You can argue, yeah, sure, it's marketing and public marketing and blah, blah, blah. You can think about Trump what you like, but the point is he understood two very important points here. So there's the high demand of a new reserve asset, which is not gold because it's kind of moved in seconds. It's hard to move gold at all, and certainly not possible in seconds over the whole planet. And that's one thing. And obviously you get in the pure freedom aspect of money, right? So that certainly can't be easily controlled. There's always two sides of this statement. You can argue, okay, he certainly does that to centralize more. Okay, you can argue that this is obviously not his like honest agenda, and he's a deeper agenda behind that. Okay, we can discuss that. And yes, I do see a risk in this advancing centralization about Bitcoin, IBIT, ETF, and Coinbase custody, etc. But on the other hand side, he actually understood a very important thing about Bitcoin. These two important things that I just mentioned about Bitcoin. This alone is, whether he means it or says the words of someone else, it's certainly a game changer. And I agree with you. It's historic time shift, yeah. And he also kicked off the CBDCs. That's great news.
Oh yeah, Bitcoin gets increasingly good reputation. And this, coming back to the first statement, I think there is at the moment kind of a bullish case for Bitcoin.
100%. And obviously this episode wouldn't be complete without saying what all Bitcoiners say, that we are still early.
Agree.
Maybe you can elaborate what you've seen in Bitcoin Prague.
Yeah, Bitcoin Prague, which in general, I think it was a really good conference with a lot of interesting people around there. And what was discussed there is like a little bit about, of course, the Bitcoin Treasury companies. In this case was made by several speakers that it is the asset that appreciates, and there are all kind of new KPIs in the space and how it makes sense. So this was really interesting to see, because that's something where you see, okay, it is a store of value. This is something people believe in now and more so. And there will be a lot of winners there. That's what the sentiment is. And then you have like the other side, the so-called cyberpunk. So those are the people who believe in self-sovereignty, in freedom, in privacy. And they think, well, yeah, it's a store of value. You understood this part about Bitcoin, but actually don't stop there, because Bitcoin is so much more. It was made for more than just being a store of value, but it is trustless. And what it gives you is actually that you have real ownership of your assets. And that's what this kind of corner really emphasizes, that be careful. So maybe if it is too easy to invest in those companies, and it makes a lot of sense because obviously not everybody is there yet to invest in kind of cold wallet and hold all responsibility yourself. So there's a transition phase, but when maybe you stop there. So the store of value, which seems to be more widely understood, that is an issue in our times, but you forget about all the rest. So you forget about the self-sovereignty, the freedom, the privacy part. So this discussion was very interesting. And what was actually the result of this discussion, that they start making things easier, because they think the user experience of Bitcoin, you need to have a certain kind of personality, and you need to have a lot of time to research and understand until you feel confident to have a cold wallet, to have all the responsibilities. And what they think the industry or everybody in this kind of movement should take on is to make the user experience of your cold wallet, for example, more easy. That you're not so afraid if you make one mistake, nobody can help you and everything is gone. So that is something I think the industry is working on now. Yeah, I think this was the key essence I saw in this conference, which was really interesting. And I absolutely agree. Yeah, and there was a lot of talk about Nostr and the identity thing, how you start real community in the age of AI. Who do you believe in? Who gave you this message? Who gave you this recommendation? Nobody knows anymore, right? So you need to start having real communities, real social networks again, and that's where the decentralized nature comes in. And again, the user experience is not there yet. It's kind of hard, takes a lot of time. But yeah, there needs to be developments there. So, and I absolutely agree.
Interesting. The Nostra is certainly worth a different and extra episode, right? So we can deep dive into that. But thanks for elaborating. It's really interesting.